You know, some stories of battle are all about grand strategy and these sweeping maneuvers. This is not one of them. This is the story of a handful of men, a tiny little mission station, and one of the most desperate last-ditch defenses in military history. And it all kicks off on one really fateful day.
Okay, so here's the scene. It's January 22nd, 1879, at this remote mission station in Natal called Rorke's Drift. Word has just come in that the main British army has been practically annihilated, and a massive Zulu force is now heading directly for them.
And just look at these odds. You've got about 150 British and colonial troops up against an army of somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Zulu warriors. It's an absolutely staggering imbalance. We're talking a classic David versus Goliath situation here.
Now, to really get the sense of desperation at Rorke's Drift, we have to back up a little bit. We have to understand the catastrophe that had happened just hours earlier and only a few miles away.
Geography was everything in this story. Rorke's Drift was sitting right on the border of the Zulu kingdom, and just 6 miles down the road was a place called Isandlwana. Earlier that very same day, the main British column had been, well, they'd been wiped out there. So this meant the defenders at the drift weren't just isolated, they were the absolute next logical target.
Can you even imagine the shock? Around noon, 2 completely exhausted survivors come riding in, and they've got the worst possible news. The battle at Isandlwana was a slaughter, and now a Zulu impi, that's a large organized fighting force, is heading straight for them. They had hours, maybe less, to get ready.
With total disaster just around the corner, the 2 junior officers in command, Lieutenant Chard and Bromhead, they had to make an impossible choice, and they had only minutes to decide. So what do? I mean, really? What's the play? Do you try to run for it with carts full of hospital patients, or do you stay and try to fortify this small, incredibly vulnerable mission post against thousands of warriors?
The crucial point was actually made by a man named Commissary James Dalton. He basically argued that a slow-moving column, weighed down with the sick and wounded, would be easily overtaken and just destroyed out in the open. Their only real chance for survival, no matter how slim, was to stay put and fight. And just like that, the decision was made.
And this was the fortress they had to defend. A simple storehouse, a small hospital, and a low stone cattle wall. It was just a collection of farm buildings, definitely not a military outpost. They somehow had to turn this into a defensible stronghold, and they had less than 2 hours to do it. Every single man who could still stand was put to work. They used anything and everything they could find. They were building these 4-foot-high walls out of massive 200-pound bags of corn, biscuit boxes, even crates of meat. They punched firing holes, called loopholes, through the hospital walls and barricaded the doors with furniture. It was this frantic, desperate effort to create some kind of defensible perimeter out of absolutely nothing.
At around 4:30 in the afternoon, the Zulu army appeared, and for the next 12 hours, this tiny garrison would face a completely relentless onslaught.
This timeline just shows you the sheer relentlessness of the attack. This wasn't just one assault. It was wave after wave, lasting from the late afternoon all through the night and into the next morning. The fighting literally never stopped, forcing the defenders to shrink their perimeter until they were all backed into this one final tiny little bastion. The fighting became this brutal, close-quarters mess. We're talking bayonets against spears, often fought hand-to-hand right over the barricades. Zulus would be crouching below the walls, trying to physically pull the rifles from the defenders' hands, while others would just clamber over the bodies of their own comrades to get at the British. But the most intense, the most desperate fighting of the entire battle took place right here, in the hospital. The Zulus managed to set the thatched roof on fire, and the building quickly became a death trap, forcing this harrowing room-by-room evacuation of all the patients trapped inside. Inside that smoke-filled building, individual acts of bravery were literally the only thing standing between the patients and certain death. You had men like Private John Williams using their bayonets, not to fight, but to hap escape holes through the interior mud walls. And while he was working, Private Alfred Hook was holding the Zulus at bay at the doorway. They dragged bedridden men through these crude holes one by one and managed to save 9 of the 11 patients. Just incredible. By the early hours of the morning, after 10 hours of constant fighting, the garrison's whole reality came down to a single number. They had started with 20,000 rounds of ammunition. Now they had only 900 left. That's just a handful of bullets for each man. They were exhausted, wounded, and right on the verge of being completely overrun. As dawn finally broke, the Zulu attack ceased. The completely exhausted defenders had somehow survived. But the story of their victory and its legacy, well, it would become far more complicated.
The numbers here are just stark. 17 British defenders were killed. On the Zulu side, they counted 351 bodies around the post, with some estimates of total dead and wounded reaching almost 1,000. It was a victory for sure, but it came at a brutal cost.
For their actions, the defenders received an absolutely astonishing number of Victoria Crosses. That's Britain's highest award for gallantry. 11 men were recognized. This was an almost unheard-of honor for a single, small engagement like this.
And to put that into context for you, this is still the most Victoria Crosses ever awarded to a single regiment for one battle. It was an absolutely extraordinary recognition of incredible bravery against impossible odds.
But, the story doesn't just end with the medals. The sheer scale of that recognition led historians to ask a pretty difficult question. Was it all pure heroism, or was there something else going on here?
See, not everyone saw heroes. The new British commander, Sir Garnet Wolseley, was, let's say, dismissive. He saw men who were trapped and had no choice but to fight. In his view, it wasn't really heroism, it was just desperation. So this leaves us with two competing ways of looking at it. There's the political view, which is that the government needed a heroic story, and fast, to distract the public back home from the humiliating disaster at Isandlwana. Then there's the military view, which basically argues that any force, outnumbered 40-1, that survives and inflicts such heavy casualties has earned its honors, regardless of any politics.
So in the end, we're left with this question. Was the defense of Rorke's Drift a pure, legendary moment of courage that stands on its own? Or was it an incredible act of survival that was later spun into a myth to cover up a national embarrassment? The truth, as it so often is probably somewhere in between.